The briefest human lifespan in history. We modern people, part of the Homo family tree, have made incredible strides during our 2.8 million year journey on Earth, with massive advancement, particularly happening in the past 200 years. And currently, we experience amazing technological achievements that have boosted global life expectancy to approximately 73 years from birth. Nevertheless, our path to reach this point wasn't smooth sailing, and we've faced countless challenges, many self-inflicted, which shows up in the surprisingly short lifespans recorded throughout history. Take 18th century France, where it ranged from 27 to 30 years. Classical Greece at 25, the Bronze Age at 26, and the Neolithic era dropped to just 20. Despite these harsh facts, Homo sapiens, meaning us modern people, have enjoyed relatively comfortable lives compared to earlier human relatives. You should feel deeply thankful for this reality, since existence as a primitive human was often absolutely brutal, and paleontologists regularly discover ancient human remains showing individuals who perished in extremely gruesome situations. Current research reveals that numerous Homo groups endured terrible existences, but one specific study discovered that a particular population, the 2 million-year-old Homo habilis, experienced almost ridiculously harsh conditions and perished so frequently at such young ages that most people never survived long enough to reach their teenage period, with average longevity calculated at roughly 12 years of age, more than 6 times shorter than today's global standard. What's even more shocking is that it's probable the actual number was lower, since researchers examined 26 random fossils and observed a shortage of newborn and baby remains, strongly indicating that death rates were actually far higher, making true life expectancy possibly under 12 years. Such rapid and brief existence makes Homo habilis the absolute worst human ancestor you could imagine being reborn as, representing arguably the most terrible period to have existed as a human being. This naturally raises the issue of why their existence was so completely miserable. Well, sadly for this species, the explanation is that nearly everything worked against their survival, including their physical forms. Homo habilis represented one of the tiniest humans who ever existed, likely measuring under 4 feet or 1.2 meters tall, making them 32% smaller than modern people, and weighing at most only 60% of our current mass. Such diminutive stature clearly left them extremely exposed to harm, and making things worse, they lacked any significant strength in their bone structure that might have at least compensated for their tiny size. They probably suffered at least one major tumble during their lifetime, since they lived partially in trees, spending significant portions of their existence in branches. Given that chimpanzees frequently suffer at least one severe fall during their lives, we can safely assume the same for Homo habilis, particularly because they weren't as perfectly suited for tree climbing as modern chimpanzees. Though compared to later humans, they displayed more ape-like traits due to being among the earliest of our ancestors to appear, existing from 2.8 to 1.65 million years in the past. Some ape-like characteristics included extended arms and somewhat primate-like hands that helped them maintain better holds during climbing and swinging between branches. Having the capacity to climb easily is naturally extremely valuable, particularly while surrounded by dangerous animals, and typically enables creatures to readily escape threats, thus extending their survival. Unfortunately for the habilis species, the advantages of this skill were mostly cancelled out, since it came with the most destructive eating habits, meat consumption. You'd assume that ancient humans living among plants would eat purely vegetarian foods, but habilis actually displayed some of the greatest amounts of meat consumption found in human ancestors, evidenced by their massive incisors that assisted them in slicing through flesh, and their unusually large jawbones that were thicker than any modern ape or person's, enabling them to create greater torque and pressure while chomping, thereby making it easier to tear meat from carcasses. While they did consume significant amounts of fruits and plants, their carnivorous diet ultimately required them to abandon tree safety regularly, a situation made worse by their love of fish, which drew them near waterways, and the perils lurking there. It wasn't simply meat that created issues, but how they obtained it, since for unknown reasons, Homo habilis chose to focus on scavenging above all else, which seems almost absurd given their tiny stature, weak muscles, and basic tools consisting of crude stone implements. Put simply, they lacked adequate means to protect their finds, and one research team discovered that they could at best successfully defend dead animals from jackals and cheetahs. This meant virtually nothing, however, since Homo habilis living in eastern and southern Africa faced not just one but numerous massive carnivores that regularly appeared to fight over carrion. Making things even worse, these identical hunters also frequently targeted habilis individuals directly, since these ancient people were, to put it mildly, vulnerable targets. So as a Homo habilis, you could count on living each day under perpetual fear of being attacked by an incredibly varied array of different meat-eaters, each possessing their own distinct, horrifying methods of killing you. At least there was some diversity. Currently, direct proof of encounters between predators and habilis remains scarce, but when examining the time frame and geographic area, over 30 possible hunters have been documented, with big cats particularly having devastating effects on shortening their lives. One of the most common threats prowling nearby would have been the Megantereon, a jaguar-sized, saber-toothed feline that inhabited Africa throughout the entire period of habilis survival. Despite having jaguar proportions, it was more robustly constructed and disturbingly possessed hind legs that were actually lion-sized. These limbs featured enormous paws at their ends containing razor-sharp, curved claws just waiting to penetrate the skin of any unwary Homo habilis. Once trapped, the victim would then endure an assortment of pointed and jagged teeth, including 2 massive canines that would pierce their neck, cutting major blood vessels and nerves, mercifully causing unconsciousness in moments. However, sadly, there was also the possibility that an unfortunate individual might have endured the less common, but far more horrifying death method of having their whole head essentially engulfed by the attacking saber-toothed predator. Incredibly, this actually occurred to a documented human fossil that bore puncture wounds on its occipital bone, meaning the rear of the skull. What's incredible is that the bite angle proved the assault didn't happen from behind, but from the front, which essentially confirms the Megantereon placed the complete human head inside its jaws. The theory suggests that beyond inflicting skull and brain injuries, such an assault could cause death by entirely blocking the person's nostrils and mouth with the saber-tooth's bite, resulting in suffocation. Adding even more terrible news for our ancient family, Megantereon possessed an enormous craving for Homo habilis, so intense that it actually changed their carbon isotope signatures, which proves directly that it killed even more humans than other creatures typically linked with hunting early people, like Dinophelus, which I should note also lived alongside Homo habilis and likely preyed upon them too. Adding insult to injury, there were also Homotherium and Machaerodus prowling nearby, which proved extremely unlucky, since the latter was among the biggest cats ever to exist, with certain varieties reaching 405 kilograms, or 893 pounds, matching both smilodons and male polar bears. At such enormous size, it's easy to see how even a well-aimed paw strike could eliminate a person, especially considering most targets appeared to be hunted while juvenile. Escaping death by Machaerodus would have been remarkably challenging, since despite its massive bulk, this predator was a superior leaper than most smaller, more nimble cats, as its legs were overly compact for extended pursuits, which suggests it depended on explosive leaps to capture victims, meaning escape by tree climbing was essentially impossible. Meanwhile, though smaller, Homotherium remained notorious as an extremely dangerous creature for habilis to encounter, since its fangs and cutting teeth were reduced but wider than those found in other saber-toothed species, converting them into devastating piercing tools that also featured crenulations. In other words, uneven serrations that created wavy patterns, producing a unique bite that simultaneously sliced and stabbed. While these felines were certainly a plague to habilis communities, they weren't the sole group famous for reducing their lifespans, since another predator family that enjoyed feasting on our forebears were hyenas. Similar to cats, there were numerous different hyenas that hunted hominins, but 2 particularly stood out: the Chasmoporthetes and Pachycrocuta. In characteristic unlucky habilis style, Pachycrocuta turned out to be among the biggest hyenas in history, with individuals not only matching a lioness in size, but also wielding a bone-crushing bite that ranks among the most powerful pound-for-pound bites of any land-dwelling mammal. This exceptionally strong bite created problems, not just because it would completely devastate you, but also since the power to shatter bones provided simple access to marrow, meaning Pachycrocuta probably appeared at many carcasses. Terrible news for our scavenging ancestors. Add in the reality that Pachycrocuta probably hunted in groups, and you suddenly face a complete nightmare of death. If captured, you'd also need to consider that in numerous cases, hyenas literally consume their victims while alive, which is definitely something I would personally prefer to avoid. This danger would have been even worse with Chasmoporthetes, a smaller, yet somehow more frightening hyena type. This belonged to an unofficial category of hyenas, described as dog-like, meaning they were more slender and agile, probably roaming in massive groups. This more delicate build might seem like positive news, but it absolutely isn't. A small yet enormous pack of canine-like hyenas devouring you would certainly be far more agonizing than being killed quickly by one giant predator. The real problem wasn't this characteristic of Chasmoporthetes, but instead its leg structure, which showed modifications built for incredible velocity, strongly resembling the limbs found in cheetahs, thus earning it the nickname running or hunting hyena. The primary issue with this was that Homo habilis, conversely, proved terrible at running and could at best manage some level of distance running. Adding to their suffering, these hyenas were also hypercarnivores, meaning over 70% of their nutrition derived from meat exclusively, a lifestyle they maintained through their razor-sharp teeth that oddly featured edges resembling those of large cats. As terrible as these creatures sound, they paled compared to what waited in the waters of Homo habilis territory. Massive crocodiles. In other words, a complete nightmare for our ancestors, especially since they had a passion for fishing, not using a fishing pole or spear, but instead with their bare hands, which almost seems like they deliberately wanted to attract hungry crocodiles. These crocs were more than willing to accommodate. The most significant species back then belonged to the identical crocodile family living currently, Crocodiles. However, you wouldn't need to fear mistaking them for any modern species, since these were absolutely massive, with the two biggest being Crocodilus thorbjarnarsoni and Crocodilus anthropophagus. You might wonder about the anthropo portion of the second name, and it exists because this crocodile specialized in eating humans, earning a title that literally translates to human devourer. Naturally, we possess direct proof of its human-eating habits, as in one location alone, 2 young habilis were discovered with serious injuries to their limbs and feet, matching this crocodile's teeth, demonstrating how they apparently focused on legs during surprise attacks, then proceeded to eliminate victims by either drowning or executing death rolls to literally tear their appendages away, which clearly occurred in both instances. In other words, definitely not a peaceful death, and resistance wasn't possible, since Anthropophagus wore extremely tough armor and exceeded typical saltwater crocodiles in size, with adults measuring 7.5 meters or 25 feet long and weighing approximately 1.5 tons. For comparison, the longest documented living crocodile, an individual called Lolong, only measured 20 feet or 6 meters and weighed merely 1.1 tons. As you can see, at this colossal size, Anthropophagus definitely possessed one devastating bite, which combined with its human-eating habits makes it appear as one truly demonic creature, perfectly suited, since it also featured 2 prominent ridges or horns above its eyes that made it not only deadly, but also visually horrifying. While it clearly represented the most dangerous crocodile for humans, it wasn't actually the biggest, as that distinction belonged to thorbjarnarsoni, a somewhat earlier crocodile that also coexisted with habilis and hunted them throughout the initial period of our ancestors' existence. Fortunately, it wasn't dramatically larger than its later relative, measuring roughly 8 meters or 26.2 feet, but that's hardly comforting, since it still makes it the biggest crocodilian species ever found, which consequently also makes it among the largest true crocodiles to have existed. Since its fossils are extremely rare, there's strong likelihood that specimens grew even bigger. What made this predator truly distinctive was its skull. Beyond being enormous, it was also much wider than what's found in other modern crocodiles, possibly representing an adaptation to better grasp and crush armored prey like giant turtles. Despite this specialization, it remained probably an opportunistic hunter that undoubtedly ate the occasional hominin. In reality, The original Homo habilis specimen, a fossil called OH7, might have been a casualty itself, since its foot and leg bones displayed large, wide, and deep puncture injuries, matching a giant crocodile's teeth. Like the other individuals I discussed previously, it appears OH7 lost its limb during this savage assault and also died. But what's astounding is that circumstances for this fossil were even more cruel than just this, since certain scientists think it wasn't only attacked by a crocodile, but a mammalian predator too. While examining the upper skeleton, paleontologists discovered that on its parietal bone, the original specimen had shallow scratch marks that didn't match any bite found in crocodiles. But instead, the injuries showed striking similarity to large cat attacks, leading to the theory that a leopard-sized mammal had bitten a piece from OH7's skull. Ouch, to say the least. While it's unknown whether this attack occurred after the individual had already perished, or if this represented an earlier assault that it survived, it's obvious that these creatures faced numerous predators to avoid. Of course, ancient cats, hyenas, and giant crocodiles were merely the beginning, since you also faced many hunters that remain alive currently, including different Panthera species, cannabinoids, raptors, and serpents. Snakes particularly were probably another crucial factor explaining Homo habilis' brief lifespan. Since despite lacking direct proof of strikes, we understand that generally serpents and hominids share a troubled relationship at best. Even now, snakes kill tens of thousands of people throughout Africa annually, with venomous species being the worst killers, while among isolated tribes, attacks by constricting serpents represent the leading cause of death for certain populations. Some researchers think serpents posed such problems for early humans that they basically triggered an evolutionary competition between both groups, with improved eyesight potentially representing an adaptation meant to better detect us hidden snakes. Not to mention that primates generally might be naturally programmed to fear serpents, at least based on several studies. In other words, it's virtually certain that Homo habilis also fell victim to snakes. The sheer number of predators that habilis' diet forced them to face was undoubtedly catastrophic for them. Yet it wasn't only carnivores that leaving the trees exposed them to, since many aggressive plant eaters and omnivores also lived in huge populations, including various ancient rhinos, hippos, massive warthogs, elephants, giraffes, and bovids. Obviously, these creatures didn't kill humans as frequently as carnivores, but fatalities still occurred. Despite being fewer in quantity and variety, plant eaters and omnivores in modern Africa caused several thousand deaths annually across the continent. If forcing them to confront dangerous animals wasn't sufficient, then it's fortunate that their diet's negative effects extended beyond this, since it probably also caused medical issues, specifically with teeth. Among the 26 people examined, only roughly 40% possessed healthy teeth, while the remainder suffered serious deterioration to their enamel, plus broken and fractured teeth. While this might not seem entirely devastating, it truly becomes alarming when you realize the oldest individual was merely 25 years old, and there were even several cases of people under 10 who already displayed major dental issues. To truly highlight this problem, one person who was 17 years old was discovered with teeth so damaged that the condition was roughly twice as severe as what you'd expect to find in a contemporary elderly person who also neglected oral care. This extraordinary universal level of destruction was entirely attributed to Homo habilis' diet, though it wasn't necessarily caused by the scavenged flesh. It might have been a mixture of meat, bone, and fibrous plant matter that created extensive deterioration. Plus, given their weak position, habilis probably didn't receive first choice regarding food, which would have meant limited options, compelling people to consume whatever they could find, regardless of whether it damaged their oral health. Another element in this restricted selection, which probably also led to additional fatalities, was their surroundings and weather. During the Pleistocene period, Africa underwent intense climate variations that caused cooling and growing dryness that made food sources extremely limited, even causing widespread hunger. Scientists think that as weather conditions deteriorated, groups needed to depend increasingly on scavenged meat to meet their calorie needs, which consequently resulted in more deaths as it placed them near additional carnivores who would have been more aggressive since they also suffered from a deteriorating environment. Fascinatingly, though perhaps unsurprisingly, the rivalry created by these environmental changes might have also caused habilis to suffer more casualties from a creature very similar to themselves, though I don't necessarily mean other habilis, despite this being certainly possible, but instead other humans. Habilis fossils have been discovered in identical locations as not only one but 3 additional Homo species, plus another hominin, these specifically being Homo rudolfensis, erectus, and Paranthropus boisei respectively. We know that encounters with these close family members sometimes turn deadly, since there's at least one documented Paranthropus individual who was clearly murdered by habilis, potentially even serving as their meal. In this specific case, the habilis claimed victory, yet with other Homo species it probably faced serious disadvantages for several reasons. First, it was the tiniest Homo species of that era, and least suited for ground-based living, so any conflict on land would have favored the others. Second, habilis sadly possessed the second smallest brain found in any human, with average brain volume between 500 and 687 cubic centimeters, making it 25% smaller than the next smallest Homo species it lived with, Rudolfensis. While erectus could occasionally have brains literally twice the size, this huge gap probably created an intelligence difference between habilis and its rivals, an idea somewhat supported by the different tools each group developed. For instance, erectus controlled fire, axes, blades, and choppers, which would have provided them enormous advantages during any battle, to say the least. Making things even worse, despite not being a hominin, I should also note that Dinopithecus was probably involved in the conflict too. And in some respects, this animal was more disturbing than several Homo species, since it was a massive primate closely related to baboons, meaning it had enormous fangs, and would have been covered with substantial muscle mass. When you consider that it might have been 3 times larger than Homo habilis, we should definitely include this creature on the already extensive list of possible predators. Ultimately, it was an extremely harsh and unjust world for Homo habilis. According to the initial research, the most dangerous period of a person's existence would have begun around age 10, when they entered a stage linked with peak death rates. Ironically, surviving to 10 initially would have already qualified you as among the fortunate ones, since another study suggests that 40% of all individuals died before reaching their 10th birthday. If we include children and babies, then it's thought that this percentage rises to 60%. This consequently would indicate that the average death age reported in the research would actually be under 12 years, which naturally leads to another question about how habilis even managed to survive for such an extended period. Perhaps the solution lies in their tools that did successfully enable them to extract marrow and tough vegetation. Additionally, there's a remote possibility that a 1.7 million-year-old shelter or basic dwelling was constructed by habilis groups, which would suggest they had methods to cope with their era's deteriorating climate. The population factor also appears to have been crucial in their remarkable prolonged existence. As scientists estimate, group sizes might have grown to 85 different individuals, thus providing greater safety and reduced likelihood that any specific person would be targeted by a predator. Though honestly, based on all evidence, this didn't appear to help them much. And perhaps the incredibly high death rate was what ultimately destroyed them. Whatever happened, one fact remains certain. Being Homo habilis was absolutely terrible.